The dust rose in spirals across the empty plains, carried by a wind that had no mercy and no memory. Sarah Millwood stood at the edge of town with nothing but the clothes on her back, a worn canvas bag, and hands that had forgotten how to be still. 3 days she'd been walking, and the sun had burned her fair skin until it cracked like the dried riverbeds that scarred this God-forsaken land. Her husband was 6 months in the ground, their homestead claimed by the bank, and every step she took felt like walking away from the only life she'd ever known. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The general store back in Redemption had given her a heel of bread out of pity, but that was gone now, crumbs scattered somewhere along the road behind her. The town ahead shimmered in the heat like a mirage, all weathered wood and false front buildings that promised nothing but another place to be turned away. She'd been turned away from 3 towns already. Widows were bad luck, people said. Widows were just another mouth to feed in a land where even the strong barely survived. The ranch appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd stopped saying. It sat alone against the horizon, a sprawling collection of corrals and outbuildings, with a main house that had seen better years but still stood proud. Cattle dotted the distant fields, moving slow as clouds. Sarah's feet carried her toward it without permission, drawn by the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. Smoke meant people. Smoke meant life. She knocked on the door with her last reserves of courage, her knuckles raw against the sun-bleached wood. The man who answered was not what she expected. He was perhaps 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder winters, but those eyes themselves were kind. He wore his dark hair longer than fashion dictated, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, showing forearms tanned the color of saddle leather. Behind him, the house stretched empty and quiet as a church on Monday. "Help you, ma'am?" His voice was rough, but not unkind. "I need work," Sarah said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I can cook, I can clean. I don't eat much, and I don't need wages, just shelter, just a place to be." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt his gaze taking in the hollow places beneath her cheekbones, the threadbare dress, the desperation she couldn't quite hide. She wanted to look away, but forced herself to meet his eyes. She'd learned that much in these 3 days of wandering. If you couldn't hold a man's gaze, he wouldn't trust you with anything, not even mercy. "I'm Jack Brennan," he said finally. "I run this place alone since my hands moved on. Could use help in the kitchen, that's true enough." He paused, something unreadable crossing his face. "But I got one condition." Sarah's heart sank. There was always a condition, always something they wanted that she couldn't give or wouldn't survive giving. "Only if you bring laughter back here, too," Jack said, and smiled. It was a sad smile, weathered as everything else in this country. "This house has been quiet too long. I don't need silence. I got plenty of that already." She didn't understand at first. She'd been prepared for cruelty, for demands, for the kind of price that would cost her soul. But laughter? She hadn't laughed since Thomas died, hadn't felt anything close to joy since the morning he'd ridden out to mend the north fence and never came home. How could she promise something she no longer possessed? "I'm not sure I remember how," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. "Then maybe we'll figure it out together," Jack said, and stepped aside to let her in. The house smelled of old coffee and loneliness. She could see it in every corner, the way dust gathered on the mantel, the single plate beside the wash basin, the chair at the head of the table worn smooth from years of solitary meals. This was a man who'd learned to live with absence, to make peace with empty rooms and conversations with ghosts. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in herself every time she passed a mirror. He showed her to a small room off the kitchen, barely more than a closet, but it had a bed with clean sheets and a window that looked out over the eastern hills. It was more than she dared hoped for. That first night, she cooked him a simple supper from the provisions in his lander, beans and cornbread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. He ate without comment, nodded his thanks, and disappeared onto the porch where she could hear him smoking in the darkness. The days fell into rhythm. She woke before dawn to start the fires, cooked meals that filled the house with smells of home, scrubbed floors that had forgotten what a woman's care looked like. Jack worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, tending cattle, doing the work of 3 men because he had no choice. They passed each other like shadows, speaking only what was necessary, moving through separate sorrows under the same roof. But she watched him. She couldn't help it. She saw the way he favored his left leg on cold mornings, the way he stood sometimes at the corral rail, just watching the horses, the way his hands were gentle with anything living. There was something broken in him, some wound that hadn't healed, and it called to the brokenness in her, like recognizing your own reflection. 3 weeks passed before she learned about the photograph. She found it while cleaning his room, a woman and a little girl, both smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that doesn't understand it's temporary. The woman had dark hair and eyes that sparkled even in faded sepia. The child couldn't have been more than 5. "That's Emma and Caroline." Jack's voice came from the doorway, making her jump. She'd thought he was out with the cattle. "My wife, my daughter." Sarah set the photograph down carefully, as if it might shatter. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "Fever took them both," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. 4 years ago this December. Caroline went first, Emma 3 days later. This house has been quiet ever since." He picked up the photograph, his calloused thumb tracing the frame. "I kept thinking noise would come back eventually, that life would fill up these rooms again, but it never did. I just got used to the silence." And suddenly Sarah understood. His condition hadn't been cruel or strange. It had been an act of survival, a desperate attempt to remember that life could be more than just existing, more than just moving through days until they stopped coming. Have you ever lived in a silence so complete that you forgot what your own laughter sounded like? Have you ever lost so much that the very act of joy felt like betraying the dead? That night, Sarah stood at the stove preparing supper, and her hands were shaking. She thought about Thomas, about the way he used to sing off-key while doing evening chores, about the terrible jokes he'd tell just to see her smile. She thought about Jack, eating alone at his table for 4 years, and about Emma and Caroline, whose laughter this house had forgotten. She thought about all the ways grief could make you disappear, bit by bit, until you were just a ghost in your own life. The biscuits burned. She'd been so lost in thought that she'd left them too long, and when she pulled them out, their tops were black as coal. She stared at them in dismay, these ruined offerings, and something inside her cracked. She laughed. It came out harsh and unexpected, rusty as a gate that hadn't been opened in years. She laughed at the burned biscuits, at herself, at the absurdity of promising laughter when she'd forgotten how, at everything broken and lost and impossible about trying to build something from ruins. The sound echoed in the kitchen, strange and half-wild. Jack appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. He looked at her, then at the burned biscuits, and his face transformed. A smile started slow, then built into something genuine, and then he was laughing too, deep and rumbling, the sound of a man remembering what joy felt like on his tongue. They stood there laughing together, 2 broken people in a kitchen full of smoke, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, it was too soon for that, but maybe the beginning of permission. Permission to be more than her grief, permission to exist in the present instead of only in the past. After that, things changed. Not all at once, but in small ways that accumulated like rainfall in a drought. Sarah started humming while she worked. Jack began eating supper at the table instead of on the porch, and they talked about small things, weather, cattle, the coyotes that sang in the hills. She told him about Thomas's terrible singing. He told her about the time Caroline had tried to rope a chicken and ended up catching herself instead. The stories hurt, but they hurt less than silence. One evening, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, Jack came in from the range and found her on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire. He sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching, and they stayed there as the stars emerged one by one. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For keeping your promise, for bringing laughter back." Sarah turned to look at him, this quiet man who'd offered her shelter and asked only that she remember how to be alive. "I think we brought it back together." The ranch still stood alone against the horizon. The wind still carried dust across the endless plains. The land was just as hard, just as unforgiving as it had always been. But inside the house, something had changed. There was music in the kitchen sometimes now. There were voices in the evening. There was laughter, tentative and fragile, but real. Sarah learned that survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about remembering that life could still surprise you, that joy could grow in the strangest soil, that two people could save each other without ever saying the words. She learned that home wasn't a place you returned to, but something you built from whatever pieces remained. And Jack learned that silence wasn't strength, that opening the door to one lost soul could chase away 4 years of ghosts, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was smile and ask for laughter. The West was still wild, still brutal, still beautiful in its harshness, but in one house on the edge of nowhere, 2 people found what they'd been missing. Not romance, not salvation, but something simpler and more profound: the courage to live again.